Throw your uppercut, try to hit me in the gut, thinking that I won't react. You whisper in my name, thinking I won't be the same to conviction in a fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home, begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. Your crying age in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round. Oh, 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 yeah. First round, fifth round, final round. No, 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 no. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh.
Hi, this is Penn. Penn Teller. Big guy does magic, smaller guy next to me, he does magic too. He doesn't talk that much. Anyway, I wanted to welcome you to In Time. Welcome you all to In Time with Nick. Love you all. Peace. Go get him, Nick.
welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter. Thank you for joining us. We had Aaron Rabinowitz. I think, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Rabinowitz, it's fine, doesn't matter.
Rabinowitz, all right. We had you on 2 weeks ago, and we don't normally book guests quite so close together, but you had said some stuff that we really wanted to talk about again, and I figured the best way to frame it would be how best to deal with extremism, which is something that we've talked about in a couple of different ways on this channel before, and is, I think, an interesting topic. And with the rise, at least what appears to be the rise of extremism, both in the U.S. and even worldwide, we see far-right candidates coming to power and or trying to seize power across various countries. We've seen it in Italy that we've spoken about before, and obviously what just happened in Brazil, which was really shocking, and we carried and talked about already, at least while it was happening. So we thought that this would be a great topic to have you on. We had been hoping Brooks could join us, but it was a little late notice for him, so he said he would try, but we enjoy having Brooks on, and he obviously always contributes a lot. So we'll see if he makes it. He hasn't yet, so my suspicion is he probably won't come in. But anyways, Aaron, thank you and welcome back. Glutton for punishment, obviously.
Yeah, well, philosopher. It's synonyms right there for you.
Yeah, it goes without saying. Well, the same thing. Well, the other thing I say about philosophers is it's sort of like if people like you as a philosopher, you're doing something wrong. I haven't met very many. The only people who like philosophers are other philosophers in my experience.
I try to keep a balance. I think some people like me and some people find me incredibly smug and condescending. And, I guess that means that I'm a perfect centrist.
Well, there you go. Well, I think what bothers people about philosophers is A, the abstract thinking, which some people have difficulty with, and B, philosophers have a tendency to get you to challenge your preconceptions or assumptions about things, and I think most people find that uncomfortable. Even philosophers. I think we
need to be more generous than that. Philosophers are disliked because they're really bad at applying themselves, and they don't study the things that they claim to be experts on, and just sort of philosophize from their ivory tower in a way that's really frustrating.
I was trying to be polite because you're a guest, but
I'm here to steal bot people's positions. I'm not going to lie. I come from a terrible stock. Do you know which departments are the worst when it comes to things like DEI? Actually, including other people, it's us. It's the philosophers. We're terrible.
Yep.
We're bad on many fronts.
It's that because if you're not teaching, it's like what did the employed philosopher say to the unemployed philosopher? Would you like fries with that?
Yes.
Yeah. So
I think we're all philosophers. Some of us just admit to it better, more than others.
Sinister Porpoise, $5. How can we prevent extremists like Gates, Boebert, and Green, and that frickin' guy from being reelected? Yeah, that's a good question. I think we'll get to it, Porpoise. I think that's definitely. I'm going to make sure I've got a note of that, so I'll make sure we get to it. I don't know that that's where we're going to start, but all right. So let me start with a question, just because it seems obvious, but I want to make sure. I've heard a few people argue that extremism isn't on the rise, and we're just noticing it more, or it's expressing itself differently. Now, we had talked about is stochastic terrorism on the rise, and your answer was much more nuanced than the obvious yes that I think most people would have. So let me ask you: is extremism on the rise in the U.S. and or across the globe?
Yes, as far as I can tell.
As far as
I think.
All right.
Yeah. So, I would say specifically, I think you're seeing a rise of far-right populism to varying degrees in several countries, but America's in a particularly bad way, it seems like, with our GOP being basically overrun with pretty extreme sort of conspiratorial, like the stuff with Kevin, right, in the House. Like, how many votes did it take for Kevin to get the speakership that will be completely useless to him and be, a horrible millstone around his neck until he retires quickly, like every Republican House Speaker in my lifetime? Like it's not going well, I think. What I'd say is it may not necessarily mean that there's going to be a huge spike. It's not going to be an open civil war or something like that necessarily. But I think, you're going to continue to see various negative outcomes, including a completely dysfunctional government.
Any thoughts as to why this is happening? Why has there been this rise in far-right populism?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things going on here. I think we talked a little bit last time about my theories about sort of conspiracism on the right in America really jumping off during and after the civil rights movement. That I think what you see is a lot of backlash to the civil rights movement expressing itself in the form of conspiracy theories about Jews using black people to control, to fight white people, or other kinds of stuff like that. And then you see it, then a bunch of other things get worse, right? So you have like this Southern strategy happening, and then on top of that you have, Watergate, followed by, Iran-Contra, like a series of genuine conspiracies by our government to do terrible things, the overthrowing of various governments in South America. So you have like a bunch of good reasons for people to be, increasingly suspicious of things like their government. Then you have a bunch of people profiteering off of that extremism, right? So I think you get into a really horrible feedback loop where right-wing media, especially with, beginning with, AM radio, but really also Fox News, and then the taking over of a lot of local news stations. You see this loop where, they're increasingly catering to this kind of extreme narrative, and they need to kind of keep heightening the narrative. And so you see this endless treadmill towards more and more extremism. And it's, there are various boring, mundane reasons, like people wanted power and money and stuff like that. I think that's probably the much more dominant reason than people actually distrusting Jews, though I think people do distrust Jews. And then you have more, I think, subtle reasons like meritocratic shame, essentially, like, when we can unpack that some, but just kind of people feeling like they are unhappy about their current status in a system that they believe should be fair and isn't, and why isn't it?
Could you describe that feedback loop a little bit too? Because we had talked about how the left is actually contributing to that feedback loop, whether they intend to or not, and they're kind of trapped in a system where they're getting, for lack of a better word, triggered. They're getting there are situations to which they feel they have to respond, but those very responses increase the problems on the right, which increases the problems on the left, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so it seems to me that like the right is in its own sort of bubble ecosystem where it's pulling in the worst of the material from the left, and there will inevitably, there are just enough people in the world that there will always be left-wing content that can be pointed to by libs of TikTok or stuff like that. And then it just gets endlessly kind of amplified in this space to give the impression of like the enemy at the gates of your society, collapse of Western civilization stuff. And, you see folks like Tucker Carlson, and I guess, I do think that the left contributes to some degree, but I think it's important to understand here that the driving force of this is not like the shallow wokeness stuff. I don't think that gets a lot of attention and buzz and whatnot. But like in the absence of any of that, you would still have, I think, a spiraling right wing because they have lost a bunch of ground in the culture wars, like genuinely lost on gay rights and trans rights and and so you're going to see violent backlash to those cultural changes, whether or not you also have drag queen story hour or something like that.
So if that's something that we have seen increasing and that we're ostensibly going to continue to see increasing, what can be done to try to either mitigate that or even roll it back some, do you think?
Yeah, and I think we can talk about like what could be done in theory and like what can be done in practice, and that way we can have a little bit of optimism and a lot of pessimism at the same time.
Perfect. Well, this is in time. We're used to pessimism, but we like optimism too. So that sounds like I like I like the
Sure.
the mix.
And we can get the pessimism out of the way first. I mean, everything I'm about to tell you is going to be like, how do you do that? I don't know. It's a giant, horrible mess. Good luck. And luck, I think.
Thank you all for coming. It's been a great show.
Yeah.
We will see you all next week. Yeah. All right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, if you're looking for action items, I'll try to give you some. But at the end of the day, like, what I'm going to tell you is we have to radically overhaul our system, I think, or like this is a kind of inevitable conclusion, with a couple of contingent factors, like there being, people who want to control power and like the history of race being what it is and such things. But like, what could we do? I think we could try to unwind our addiction to meritocracy, which I think, was put forward as a noble alternative to its predecessor, nepotism of various sorts, or feudalism, whatever we want to say precedes this meritocratic ideal, or aristocracy, right? And we bring in the system to try to have a more just and fair society. And what we end up with, I think, is a still deeply unjust and unfair society, but one that we all have to pretend is, if not totally just and fair, like close to it, if you take out a couple of factors that can be, that aren't that big a deal or something like that. And so at the end of the day, we're all mostly comfortable believing that like people generally get what they deserve in our society, and that like the people who don't, we take care of them well enough, and that's fine. When like I think the reality is we need to radically redistribute wealth, and really seriously like reassess how we approach meaning in people's lives if we're going to give them an alternative to stuff like QAnon.
What are some of the unfairness? What are some of the unfair elements of meritocracy? It seems to me that, well, gee, if you're going to be rewarded for being able to excel in a certain area, that's a good thing, and if you can't compete, maybe you find another area where you can compete. What's the issue with that?
Right, and this is part of the issue, is that there is a strong intuitive plausibility, ethically speaking, to meritocracy. And if we don't have, I think, a strong argument against that, we're in a lot of trouble. But we should also, I think, really like drill down on what we mean by meritocracy, and then like what are the different levels of critique of it. So some people, when you get into an argument about meritocracy, what they might end up claiming that they are arguing for is just the idea that we should, if someone is the best doctor, they should be the doctor, right? Like if you have 10 people and one of them is really good at doctoring, make that person the doctor, right? And that's not really actually what most people think when they're thinking about meritocracy in the world, though, right? How it actually plays out in reality is people tend to think that if somebody works really hard and learns all the things they need to be a doctor, then they deserve to be much richer than someone who doesn't do that work. And some of them will go so far as to think that like Elon Musk deserves to have the billions of dollars that he has or something, right? Or Bezos or any of these folks. So I think it's really important to like, when we talk about meritocracy, we're talking about the claim that people deserve the rewards or punishments or benefits or costs that come from, the decisions they make within a fair society, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. And that is, again, still very intuitively, ethically plausible. If you believe in free will and you believe in moral responsibility, which I don't, like, it makes sense that you would want to have a system like that. So then what are like the critiques of that? There are a couple of levels of them, right? You have your meritocracy is good, but we just don't have it yet kind of level. That's like the weak critique. And then there's the strong critique, which is going to be, even if we could have a perfectly functioning meritocracy, that would still be a bad thing, and we shouldn't aim for that. And I lean more towards that second position. I think most folks will acknowledge that we don't have a perfectly functioning meritocracy right now. You can haggle over how far off we are from it. I think we're very, very far off. But I think the more like important debate is, fundamentally there are sort of moral flaws with enacting a meritocracy, even one that works. So like what are the unfairnesses about a system like that, right? Take for example, something that let's see. Take any scarce resource, right? Like, let's assume that there's going to be some scarce resources in this situation, right? You're going to end up allocating them, and there's going to be more resources to allocate than there's going to be more candidates for something, right? So in that situation,
more people who need the resources than there are resources available.
Right. So in that situation, your options are like, what do you do, right? Do you increasingly refine your criteria for who's the best one until you find who's actually the best one? Or do you flip a coin, right? Like a true meritocratic view is going to say you should keep refining and refining until you find the absolute best one. Whereas my view is going to end up leaning towards more like the coin toss. The reason being, there's a lot of harms that come from doing the other thing, right? And those harms are ones that we're all aware of, like workaholism amongst teens in high school trying to get into the best colleges, leading to workaholism amongst the meritocratic elites who make lots of money but can never have time to spend it because they have to be too busy working, what they call this conspicuous production. So these are various kinds of unnecessary harms that I think a meritocracy produces. The unfairnesses would be things like your ability to work hard is not actually something you chose or deserve, reward for in this kind of way. And we should stop thinking of it in those ways and start thinking about it in the sense that like everyone needs all of the basic goods that are important for a life of flourishing and should have access to them, whether or not we believe that they have worked in such a way that merits getting those resources.
Well, now it's okay. So at first it sounded like we were talking about okay. Are you saying that everyone should have a base level of, because we also have, we have more food, more water, more air than the species needs. We have more comforts available than the species needs. So are you suggesting some way in which everybody gets the same amount, or are you suggesting some way in which there is a bottom below which you cannot fall, and then some other means, whether it's capitalist or whatever, some other means of distributing the surplus over that?
Yeah, so I'm sort of for a mixed system to some extent. I think it's okay to have not perfect equality or something like that. I think generally we want to be aiming towards equitable outcomes in the sense that everyone has basic needs met, everyone's dignity is respected, everyone is able to live a life of flourishing as much as society can provide, and then insofar as there is excess above that, that will, I'm okay with some amount of innovation market kind of stuff. It's important to note, for example, that a free market system is not a meritocratic system. This is something that folks like Markovitz points out in his book about meritocracy. And this was very explicit in the people who, in the writings of the people who advanced sort of the free market system, that value in a market is not the same thing as merit. Those things are very easily conflated, I think, in people's minds. But markets very often will value things that are not good for people, right? That do not have merit in any reasonable sense of the term. We all are familiar with reality television, right? So, so that being said, I'm okay with some amount of market innovation being the way in which some amount of change occurs. I don't think there should be a market dynamic for basic needs like healthcare. But more importantly, I think we want to get away from teaching everyone that your value is ascribed to your accomplishments, and your accomplishments are determined by your hard work, And if you do not have a great deal of accomplishments, then you are like clearly lazy or something, right? Because that's how we get to this place of thinking that poor people are lazy, which is almost never the case, right? Like the reality is poor people work much harder a lot of the time and make less as a result of it. And we're all kind of aware of that, but we pretend that we're not a lot of the time, in a way that, like, I think is really unethical. I think we obviously are keenly aware that this isn't a meritocratic system, but we, again, sort of downplay those parts of it. And I think this is something that I talk about with conservatives. I think it's particularly bad in rural white culture. Like, I think when you talk about, so to tie this back to the extremism, right, what's driving extremism on the right, one of the things is, I think, a lot of people, especially religious people, believe that it's a just universe because God is there and it's just, but they're not having a good life despite living in that just universe. So someone is clearly keeping them from that good quality of life, and that would have to be, you know, globalists or whatever, right? Some sort of conspiracy that's preventing them, because they know they work hard, like they're working very hard, but they're not succeeding. So either they're actually really terrible people and God is punishing them, or they're living in an unjust system, and either way, they're going to end up angry, right?
So finding a way to now you had said it earlier, at least to start mitigating that meritocracy would, in your view, help mitigate at least some of this extremism.
I hope so. That's sort of that's kind of the project that I'm working on with the PhD, is like developing a sort of way of teaching and talking about luck that helps people kind of come to terms with the fact that everything about them and their world and our lives and everything is luck all the way down, and how that, as a counter perspective, can undercut the kind of meritocratic moral argument that we talked about, and at the same time help ease meritocratic shame, help promote, you know, humility amongst individuals who are successful, compassion for those who aren't. I think there are lots of positive outcomes to this kind of change in perspective. And like, my sense so far is, if we don't change this sort of baseline philosophical perspective, attempts to like just fiddle around the edges or create a more just meritocracy is just going to make the problem worse. Another, you know, big point that like Markowitz, just to sort of add something in here, that Markowitz highlights about meritocracy, that is that at the end of the day, you're just going to reproduce aristocracy with better PR, because some people are going to have more resources, and they're going to spend those resources to give their children the best chances that they can have to do things. And so meritocratic eliteship is going to be passed down generationally, not perfectly, but like pretty reliably. That's why we have, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars going into private tutors and stuff, because, you know, again, that system, if you have, you know, if the difference between getting into Harvard or not is that 1 percentage point, then the people who have the most wealth are going to be the ones getting into Harvard, because they're going to be the ones that can put in that extra effort to get that extra percentage point.
Well, and I think people at the top of the meritocracy would argue, and I think at least in terms of that meritocracy correctly, they would argue that what's the point of the meritocracy if you're not capable of giving to your kids, right, and to making sure that those who you love most in this world have the greatest benefits. So, but then of course then they have that leg up over somebody who would perhaps be just as qualified within the confines of whatever the meritocracy is determined, qualified, and but does not have the advantage of the wealth. Is that roughly accurate?
Yeah, and we have to pick and choose as like philosophers if we're going to go out in the world and try to change people's intuitions and thereby upend society. You're going to have to pick your battles in which psychological factors or features of human beings you're actually going to be able to move the needle on. And I've had a decent amount of success, I would say, sort of luck pilling people in this way. I would never take a swing at trying to like convince parents to not give their children like everything they possibly can, right? Like there are parts of our biology that are so powerful that like let's just be realistic about, so instead what you want to do is create a system where every parent can send their child to a good college without having to do, without having to like fake that's that scandal, right? That came out recently, or like, the non-scandal version where you just, Tiger mom or Jew mom or whatever Andorian mother your parent your way into like making a child that can do all of the things that they need to like succeed in a meritocratic society, but they're miserable, right? They're hollowed out. They're when I teach all of my students, when I ask them like, are you overworked, they all think they are, and they all I think they believe they have to tell me that they are. Like I think they are correct in believing that in our system, we don't want to judge them based on their skill anymore because we decided that skill and ability are not, a fair assessment because they're luck, right? But we haven't accepted that the hard work side is also luck. And so we tell them, over and over, like, you just put in the extra work and, something will happen, it'll work out or something like that. And they believe then that they have to signal that they are right on the edge of breakdown at all times, because otherwise they're just, not working hard enough and don't deserve an A.
But human beings, and that makes a lot of sense. So and I've been through that. I find that interesting that the way you phrase that they have to signal that they're sort of on the edge of a breakdown all the time, or else it's going to be perceived that they're not doing a sufficient amount of work, regardless of whether they are or not. But human beings have this ability to adapt, right? And, we have life so much easier than, our ancestors 200 years ago, certainly than the 100,000 years before that. We live longer, have more free time, more things to do with that free time, so on and so forth. And yet we have this overwhelming anger that's coming from, at least right now, coming mostly from the right. What's to say if we didn't balance things out more, we wouldn't once again end up in a situation where there was a party that was hair-splitting at some level, and we'd just end up with extremism again.
Yeah, it's possible. I'm not sure that there's a way out of extremism. Even when you get the super intelligent supercomputers controlling all of society for us, there's still going to be resistance or something like that, right? So I don't think you can take extremism to zero. I think you can just minimize the likelihood that there are individuals who are likely to slide in that direction. So, one way to do that is reduce wealth inequality, but that's not the only thing, right? You need to give people meaningful projects of worth as an alternative, right? A lot of people engage in conspiracy theories and become extremists because it gives them a life narrative where they're the hero and they're doing something, right? And if they're sitting in a society where, yes, their basic needs are met, but they're not doing anything where they feel like they have worth and meaning, where society is respecting them for what they are doing, they will, some amount of them will become resentful about that, right? This is, I think, partly why it's the case where, when you look at January 6th, as y'all did in depth, apparently, there wasn't a bunch of poor people, right? A lot of the people who were there were middle or upper middle class, and they're just as angry. And I think, I'll give the conservatives credit. While I think they are wrong about the solutions, I think they're right that there's a crisis of meaning in liberalism, where I think that, like, liberalism's goal was to reduce harm, and it was to allow for a pluralistic society where people could be who they were going to be without getting beat up as much as possible, and we could all sort of coexist as best we could in this way. And it resulted in creating a very thin account of meaning in our society. And so people turn to some pretty extreme outlets, I think, to find that sense of meaning again. Some of the people will say that wokeness is one thing on the left that people have turned to feel like, that sense of meaning. And so I think we have to give people good ways to feel like their lives are meaningful, not just like basic, universal income, which I think is a good thing, but also like some way to convey that they're doing something that is valuable, community, stuff like that.
And I want to pass this off to his Andring in just a minute or two. I think he's going to have some thoughts. I'm sure he is. But I did want to ask you. You had mentioned about flipping a coin as possibly a better maybe not the best solution, but certainly better than the meritocracy. Have you read? I assume you've read Frank Turek, Why the Numbers Don't Count, which was a paper against utilitarianism.
Yes. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, what are your thoughts about that argument? That essentially he had used an example of a boat going towards an island. Volcano goes on the island. You have, say, 500 on the north, 500 people on the north of the island, 200 people on the south of the island. The boat can hold 500, so you can hold either. You can go rescue. You have time only to rescue the north or the south. And he argued, flip a coin. That's the only fair way to do it.
Yeah, and I love this. I took a grad ethics course with Larry Temkin, who's one of the big people in the world of fairness, equity, all these kinds of and we did that paper. We did Temkin stuff about how there is no sort of perfect line on these kind of things, and I think that's true. I think the answer is flip a coin in that situation, and I think that even weirder, it's probably the case that if there's 500, say 408 or 98 on one side and 502 on the other, right? You should probably still be flipping a coin, because, and this I don't know how far into the weeds we want to get on this, but there is no perfect equilibrium for the trading off of costs and benefits in the populations in these kinds of ways. So I wrote a paper for Larry where I gave the example of a bunch of different diseases, right? And they're on a spectrum where you have one that's incredibly curable, but really not a big deal, right? It's a mild itch or something. We could totally cure it for X amount of dollars, but is that worth doing? And then on the other side, you have a very rare, incredibly painful poison, in the jungle or something that we can cure people from that, but it will only help 5 people a year or something. So do you help 1 million people alleviate their itch, or 5 people not die from hideous venom, right? And then you have the whole spectrum in between those things of all of the humanitarian activities that one could engage in, bed nets, et cetera, right? Somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, there's a range of options that are makes this argument for a mixed luckocracy in his book, and other folks have, I think, also pushed for a kind of luckocracy in various places where, take colleges, for example, instead of having this incredibly insane, increasingly obsessive hoops you have to jump through to get into these colleges, have a baseline of expectations and then flip coins for your pool of applicants. This has a bunch of benefits. For example, you could do that. You could do a lottery. You could do a weighted lottery system, right? So you could, for example, have a luckocracy where you mix in some affirmative action, and individuals in marginalized communities are slightly weighted in the lottery. At the end of the day, though, everybody who goes to the school because they won the lottery. And no one can point to anybody and say, you're here for some other reason besides luck, whereas I'm not, that kind of thing. So I think there are a lot of benefits to that. There's also interesting studies that suggest that the flip the coin version actually gets you better outcomes than the highly obsessive trying to find the exact right person approach. So I think that, there's a lot of good reasons for why this could be practical and not just a more ethical approach.
All right, and Sinister, I saw Sinister made a comment, and I still have her super chat, but she also made a comment. Not that Frank Turek. No, not that. I got the name wrong. I'm so used to talking about Frank Turek, who's a Christian apologist who's likes to claim he's a philosopher, and certainly I think he has a PhD in it. And he knows how to argue, but I think it ends there. But anyways, I mistakenly said Frank Turek instead of Paul Turek. It was Paul Turek who wrote Why the Numbers Shouldn't Matter, which was a paper on anti-utilitarianism. So I mistakenly said Frank Turek. So thank you for that correction. Is Andring, any thoughts, comments, questions, suggestions?
Wait, no, you're thinking John Turek. Should the numbers count? Did I say Paul? Right?
Yes. Should the numbers count? It's that's John Turek. John Turek, yes. Should the numbers count? That is correct, and that was his argument for why the only fair thing, among other things, and because he's pretty extreme.
Like he goes for the saving one is as ethical as saving five kind of thing.
Yeah, if you had one on the south of the island and 500 in the north, the reason I usually use 500 versus 200 is because I have a counter to his argument. But that counter is based on the fact that it's already been randomized. Let's assume, for example, on this island, everybody works in the north, everybody takes their weekends on the south, but it's a different 2 days and a different 5 days for everybody. So they cycle through, and on any given time, there is a 5 in 7 chance you'll be on the north, 2 in 7 chance you'll be on the south. So at the moment that the volcano happens, Turek freezes time at that point and says, okay, now here's the situation we're in. Let's flip a coin to randomize it, but it's already been randomized. If you say beforehand the boat will always go to the north, you give everybody on the island a 5 in 7 chance versus giving everybody a 50 chance if you flip a coin at the point of the volcano. That's my argument against it. So I tweak his example to 500 and 200 because the math works out easier that way. But yeah, he'd argue again, there's no common agent that lets you add the suffering of all those people. So it'd say, the only fair way to do it is flip a coin to give everybody a 50% chance. But you give absolutely everybody a 5 in 7 chance if you just acknowledge it's going to be a utilitarian decision from the outset and take time into account.
And I don't think you have to follow all of that to necessarily understand part of the point of this, which is ethics, and especially population ethics, is counterintuitive often. That we have a very strong, evolved, intuitive sense of fairness and moral reasoning to some extent. And some of those intuitions are quite good, and some of them are quite bad. And we have to sort of parse them through argument. And so a lot of ethical theorizing is kind of pointing out that what seems obvious is not actually true in a variety of situations.
And thank you for bringing us back to the ground. I appreciate it. Is Andring, any thoughts?
Well, interesting. We should end up back on a highly evolved sense of moral justification or moral instincts. Because I think that some of the problems that we face today, I'm not sure that we're going to solve. Because it's like human beings evolved to be social animals, but social in smaller groups. We weren't evolved to live in large mega cities so close to each other where there's so much anonymity. If you look all throughout most of human history, human beings have been tribal, and they lived in tribes, generally speaking, less than 1,000 per tribe. So you knew all of the people in your tribe. And I think that a lot of the problems that we face today comes from the introduction of anonymity. You can act as an agent without anybody knowing who you are or what your actions actually are, which introduces a whole hell of a lot of corruption into the deal. So our evolutionary path that we have taken has limited us, and now we're trying to scramble to come up with all of these fixes for problems that we start encountering when we went to agricultural and started building larger cities and started collecting in groups much larger than we were ever evolved to really manage or deal with. So we have all of these problems, and this is where I think our kind of very strong and fairly consistent across the entire globe sense of morality comes in, because it works very, very well when you're in a group of 1,000 or less people where everybody, at least know their names, recognize their faces, etc. It works very, very well because the people who are being lazy, the people who are truly needy and can't help themselves, and you're able to parse all of that and apply charity where it's needed and butt kicking where it's needed. Now we don't have any of that. We've lost all of that because we live in these, especially with the internet. we now have this whole ocean of people that are anonymous. We don't know who they are. We're probably never going to see them. We wouldn't know them on the street if we passed them. We absolutely have no idea if they're just, lazy and trying to take advantage of other people's work, or if they're truly incapable of caring for themselves. And all of those people exist in the world. And people tend to have very strong aversion to helping lazy people, and tend to really want to help people who are genuinely unfortunate and can't help themselves. I mean, I'm shocked at the consistency of that around the world. It's not just a Western culture thing or an Eastern culture thing. It seems to be a human thing. So I'm not sure how, with the complexity and more complex by the day that humanity is getting, that we can actually solve a lot of these problems. We've got some systems in place that have worked fairly decently overall, broad spectrum. There's plenty of examples of individuals that got completely shafted. But we've ended up kind of where we are for a reason. And it's because that's kind of sort of what's worked the best. And a lot of people don't like getting rid of that, because it's like, look, it's worked for a long time, which of course isn't necessarily a good justification for continuing to do something, because they did it this way for 100 years. And I realize that, but a lot of people are very resistant to wanting to change those things, because look, we're still here after 100 years. And, evolutionarily speaking, that's a success. And we all evolved, so we all have to follow those same evolutionary principles.
That's a pretty small time frame for evolution, though. Like, evolutionarily, that's not a success. That's barely even an experiment.
Well, except that on the individual level, it's a success.
Sure, but like even by cultural standards, thousands of years is longer than, like meritocracy is a very sort of relatively new idea. You could argue that it exists somewhat in Plato's writings as well, but the sort of modern version doesn't come along until 60, 70 years ago, like this terminology becomes popular. I want to agree with you somewhat and disagree with you. Like, I think you're right that we didn't necessarily evolve to deal with ethical concerns on such a large scale. I think it's part of why I'm concerned that we're not going to deal with climate change effectively. I think, as human beings, we're just not at a scale beyond which we're able to really comprehend a lot of the time, which is not ideal. I do think that anonymity is part of the problem, and the sort of decentralizing of community, that we no longer have a close local community in an area that we stick near for large periods of time. We make different communities where we move around, but they're often, sort of not permanent, or various issues like that. So I do think that is part of the issue, and is like feeding that kind of meaning crisis that I was talking about, because I think for a lot of people, putting down roots and having a stable community is part of how they develop a sense of meaning in their lives. My silver lining of optimism is that I think evolutionarily human beings are built primarily to adapt. That's what we're best at, and we are sort of adaptation machines, and it's why we've spread across the planet in the way that we have. And so, like, I think I want to be skeptical about claims that, human nature is X and therefore can't change, and so the world will have to change. I think it's very much the case that human nature changes, and that we can shift human nature, and reinvent what it means to have community to some extent, where, in the same way that like people growing up today make less of a psychological distinction between online and the real world, quote unquote, people's, relationships online will likely become more meaningful to them. There will still be anonymity online, but there will also be deep personal connections. And so I do think that like all hope is not lost on that front, and we can still have sort of modernity and cities and internet and whatnot, while also, feeling connected to people.
I absolutely agree that we are amazingly adaptable, malleable even. We do and still face the challenge of our genetics not particularly changing. We're not selecting for much of anything. At least we're not specifically selecting for the traits that we would want for this new world, and I would argue that it'd probably be immoral to try and do that anyway. But
nor does it actually probably work that way.
Say again?
I mean, it probably doesn't work that way either, right? Like the nature of epigenetics and all that, such that like there's no controlled selection. There was never controlled selection. There's a bunch of messy selection, and like, you know, a variety of adaptations arise, and like it's complex. But I think human adaptation isn't about genetic adaptation. That's the whole point of culture, is that it allows humans to adapt much faster than biological adaptation. And so we develop tools, and we, you know, put those tools to work, improving our quality of life. And that's our great ability as human beings, is to rebuild the world in our image in this kind of way. We just have to not kill the planet while we do it. That's the concern.
Yeah, and I agree that that's one of our great strengths. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons we're even still around, is we have the ability to do a hell of a lot where we don't have to change necessarily our genetics in order to improve our lot in the world. There is still a genetic component that isn't specifically going any particular direction, which, you know, leads me to believe that we're still going to have some of these problems. And I'm not sure that, you know, I mean, even you have said, I don't know that we could even get rid of all of them, even if we had the perfect system in place. You know, we would still end up with somebody somewhere would get resentful, and then we would have, you know, a rise of violence again, or extremism. So I think it's a problem that we're always going to be facing. And the question is how do we try and mitigate the problem that's always going to be there? And I'm like, kind of like you, I'm like, I have absolutely no idea how you possibly do that. Things have become so complex. We've got so much information overwhelming so many different people that unless you want to get truly draconian, and there's huge problems, if you go that route, it's like you can't stop all of this. You know, there's always going to be large groups of people that are going to be conspiratorial minded. I cannot say that word.
I'm not sure that's necessarily true. So, like, I think we have to be careful not to slip into fatalism, because I think, you know, minds can change and material situations can change. And if you improve material situations and you improve people's understanding of things, there will still be some percentage of people who are sympathetic to conspiracy theories, but I don't think you'll have the level of extremism that we're seeing sort of peaking right now in America.
Oh, and I don't disagree with that. But the question, and the $1 million question at that, is how do you do that effectively?
Yeah, and that's hard, because I think the GOP, like, and I don't throw this term around lightly as an ironic cult leader myself, I think the GOP is effectively a cult at this point. It is a highly insulated group where you have very explicit expectations, where you're going to commit to the big fraud about the election and all these kinds of things, and pulling someone out of a space like that is very difficult. If they don't get ostracized from within because they violated some code, they likely are not going to necessarily want to leave, because so much of their world is going to be attached to that space. So much of their sense of meaning and value is going to be attached to that world. So, you know, I don't know exactly how we break the spiral with the GOP right now. My hope is that there's something that does it. And what I'm working on is trying to provide an alternative and share it with as many people as possible. And I think what that looks like is having as many people really sort of acknowledging that, like, our sort of half-baked ideas about luck end up driving a lot of these problems at a root level, cultivating more sort of compassion and humility, which I hope would lead to changes in policy in terms of, you know, both things like the social safety net and access to various goods that I think are important for people's, you know, quality of life and meaning and all these things. And that would sort of, over time, right, this is a long game, change culture. You would, in theory, you know, push for things like overhauling the criminal justice system as well. And that would, you know, reduce recidivism, increase rehabilitation, which would in turn mean more happy, flourishing people and less people have to pay being in prison, right? You start to compound these factors, and you reduce the number of people who feel justified in like spiraling into conspiracism. You know, a lot of people become conspiracy theorists because they are, mistreated by the government in some way, in like a genuine way, like they are targeted by police harassment or something, or, end up in the criminal justice system, and then it becomes a self-feeding cycle because it's a for-profit model now, which is insane. Like, absolutely should be illegal. So yeah, I think there are ways that we can improve the system. I don't know if it's going to go all the way off the cliff and into the wall before then, but I'm hoping not. But I probably won't be alive to know the answer to that question. So
yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the solutions that I've heard people say, well, this will help. Not just you, but there's been several others that have proposed something saying, well, if we could do this. And it's like, okay, but that's going to take literally generations. So it's like, we don't even know today whether will be effective or not, and we will never know. We can only hypothesize that, hey, it in theory it makes sense that it should make things better. But there's been a lot of, I'm going to hesitate to say that because now I have to try and bring up an exact example of what I'm talking about, and I can't think of one. So hopefully we can do that, but I don't know. I worry about, because I follow quite a lot of very right-wing people and right-wing groups and things like that. I am constantly getting kicked out of them too, which is annoying as hell because I get called a Poe, and then it's like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be on the right here with you guys, and I'm trying to help you here because you're making really, really bad arguments, and you're making, it's like, no, you need to stop this. This isn't right. This isn't even true. And then I'm just banned. But
you're at the wrong party.
Yeah, I guess. It's like, I'm trying to help you here. I'm trying to help several of these groups, and then they just get mad at me and kick me out because I guess I didn't drink the Kool-Aid enough for them. I abandoned my rational thought and just went whole hog with whatever the populist narrative of that group happens to be. And I try to avoid doing that. I like to have reasons for believing things, reasons. I'm sorry, I'm getting bombarded suddenly with a whole bunch of stuff across my screen. I think I've been infected. They're hacking me. They're trying to shut me down. Anyway, so I've been in a lot of these groups, and there's definitely a perception, and I don't know if it's because I'm looking for it, I'm finding it, or if it actually is happening, that the resentment is growing, the number of people who are willing to resort to violence is growing, the impression or the lack of grace towards other people is increasing. Instead of giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, now you just come straight out attacking them, and it's concerning because I also happen to do a lot of stuff with, say, self-defense, and there's this perception, especially on the right, but not necessarily just on the right, because I've seen this same perception happen on the left, but they look at it through a different way, of the rule of law is breaking down. The perception of the rule of law is breaking down. It's like both the left and the right believe that we don't really have, or we're losing the rule of law. And that perception is required in order to even have a civilization. So that is concerning. I'm seeing people on the right that are, say, concealed carry permit holders are willing to kill people more frequently. I've seen several videos of self-defense. This is a self-selecting one because it has to be on video in order for us to even be able to watch it. So, and nobody would post it if it wasn't worth watching. So it's kind of hard to tell exactly whether it's actually increasing or if more people are just finding actual videos of this to post. But that I've been seeing some fairly questionable, or at least when you watch it, it's really questionable whether or not that person was actually justified. And some of the actions after things start are like, wow, that's really questionable. And it gets a lot more concerning. It's like, they're just letting all these criminals back out on the streets. These are the comments to a lot of these videos. They're just letting all these criminals back out on the street. This person in this video was arrested 7 times or 11 times for, assault, 4 of which were aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. And he's still out on the street to kill another person. And it's like, well, we just need to end him and save taxpayers money and not have to worry about this criminal being on the streets anymore. I'm seeing a lot more of that rhetoric pop up. And it does get a bit concerning because I live in this world too. And I wonder how you can even slow it down. It doesn't appear that a lot of the actions that you would advocate for, which I, at least on the surface, agree with everything that you've said about trying to improve those things.
Is I'm going to interrupt you. If you could just quickly wrap it up and then let Aaron answer, because Brooks has shown up and I want to.
Oh, sweet, Brooks has shown up. Oh yeah, so
Hello.
I'm worried about that, and I'm not sure if the solutions can work fast enough to overcome the deterioration. Do you think that these solutions can overcome this deterioration?
I really genuinely don't know. Like, I genuinely think that it's, the GOP, since the civil rights, has been selling a bill of goods to white people in this country and telling them that, like, they are disempowered because of X other groups of people, and it has now become like outright they are defrauding you in your elections. You no longer, like, they have to kind of continuously escalate the severity of how they are being mistreated in order to continue this approach. I don't know how they're gonna break out of that. And I don't, it doesn't seem like there's anyone in the party who's got the ability to do anything about this. The most extreme part of the wing is in control at this point. So short of them getting a bunch of things that they want, which I think would be bad for society, I don't see any immediate solutions to that. I think what we have to hope for is that, like, at the end of the day, while there will be increased, domestic terrorist activity and increased dysfunction within our government, you see the recent midterm elections, like, they went relatively well for the left, all things considered. And I think that should give us a little hope that, like, there is a floor to how bad the GOP can get before it is really suffering in a way where it has to, like, tack back towards moderateness and try to shove all of this violent, dangerous rhetoric back in the closet, which is what it did. This is, like, not the first wave of this, right? You have tough on crime during the 80s, leading to, like, the 90s and anti-government stuff. And, like, I think, the way I think we break out of those cycles, though, is by creating an alternative that is not this kind of meritocratic nightmare that we're living in. Yes, that is a multi-generational project, but, like, it took us 500 years to get into this problem. It's not going to be solved in a single generation. That's just not how like severe cultural problems work, I think.
All right. Well, that said, thank you. Thank you very much. So, Brooks, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can. We can hear you very well. So rather than do introductions, I think, have you been watching any of the show? Do you know roughly where we are? Do you have any comments, thoughts, questions?
I was working up until about 10 minutes ago, and I've just been watching the last little bit. So I think I'm generally caught up. So
you watch my
I love you, 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐿𝐴. You know how I love you.
Oh, it's great to see you too. I'm so happy you could make it.
No, I'm glad. It's again, I think we're talking about a lot of, and I think this is the reason, Nick, where you invited me to it. We're talking about the same thing. How do we deal with people who, and I believe, actively want their own repression? I believe it's far more than just 5 or 10% of the population. I think it's easily the vast majority, if not 80% So how do we actually deal with that? And how do we, change this hyper radicalization that seems to be taking place, or that seems to be pushing further and further and further? It's a dear to my heart, given my dad is a hardcore Trumper. So it is a thing that we'll just say yields personal issues. It's family. And I'm not alone in this. Anyone who's born in the Midwest for certain, but anyone who's born in the South, who kind of, I make my move, I'm outside Portland, I'm one of those people, or I moved to California, you've got family. This is your family. This is your kin. From family from West Virginia. You think I agree with them politically? Like, these are the people we care about, or who helped create us, spawn us, build us. And is there anything we can do? Because it's not just sort of for them, or, like, I'm not trying to say for their souls, but, short of, lining them up against the wall, like, what do we do? How do we fix this so that way it's a thing that we can be proud of as a country.
Block
So,
Fox News in their house.
Sorry, what was that?
Sorry, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, like, if we really want to sit down and talk about, like, how do you deprogram people who are in a cult, there are some basic principles, like get them away from the media that the cult is promoting. So get them out of the house, away from the television, away from the internet, away from those kinds of groups, have them interacting with normal, I use a term relative here for all involved, obviously, but like people who are not in that, epistemic bubble, have them around those people, have them experiencing how other folks' lives are not in this constant life and death struggle mindset, and be compassionate towards them when they try to relapse a little bit because they're not feeling the same level of meaning, or they're not getting the dopamine hits that they were getting before from watching Tucker or whatever. I think that's the best you can do, honestly. Like that's the retail work.
I have a different take, because for me, Fox News and the hyper-radicalization of a small percentage of the population, I think is more of the way we might say that if you've got a cough, that's what makes you go to the doctor to find out that you have cancer. If we go back 20 years, my dad and my grandfather, before Fox News, granted, 23 years, whatever you want to say, so like 97. You go to the early 90s, my grandfather, who was a son of a bitch, CNN was what he watched all day. And what he did is he, like a lot of people, simply took the stories he saw and turned them into what he had already decided they would be. He saw stories about refugees, and I don't have to repeat what he would say about such things. He would see what was a classic sort of liberal, semi-right version, CNN, and he would extrapolate and turn it into fairly hardcore right-wing beliefs. And this is a thing that we've had, like, again, the Trumpism isn't new. Trumpism is just the explosion of what I believe is the undercurrent sort of standard political view within America. A lot of what Trump and his cronies want to do, Reagan wanted to do, Bush wanted to do, Clinton wanted to do, and Obama wanted to do. Like, this is not like new American stuff. Some of the shit is wild, but again, we haven't exactly been like on either side this wild egalitarian country. We are a shit country who does a lot of really awful things. What Fox News has done is given voice to the people who are the worst of the worst and who have sort of a chance to go to that extreme level. But what it does is it also gives lay sort of cover to people like my father, who aren't that far gone, but are absolutely on the right of things, who are, not the types who necessarily, would storm the Capitol on January 6th, but are the people who go, oh, she was unarmed. Babbitt was unarmed. Why would you shoot her? That conversation is one that would happen no matter if it comes out of Hannity's mouth or it comes out of someone who's more hardcore, that someone being shot who's on their supposed political side. These are the conversations that have been happening my entire life. And so the question I would have is, at this time, aside from obviously there is a generalized larger radicalization and a way that they instantiate. I'm in Portland. We have Proud Boys active. Like, that's a thing we have to deal with. We see people walking around with guns. It's fucked up. Like, I have that. My brother's in Texas, so he's got that whole thing to deal with. So we moved to the little bastions inside of all of it. But I would ask, like, if there is a project to aim at, is it that we're aiming at extremism so we can tamper extremism but maintain the same general hegemony? Or is there a push we can start making to actually pushing the general culture into a different direction? Because I would argue Biden's America 10 years ago, if he had been president, is not wildly different from a lot of the stuff that we're seeing. And by the way, we're still seeing extraordinary amounts of money given to police, the hyper-militarization there, money spent on wars all over the world, drone programs that are killing people, extraordinary right-wing activities, and very partial left-wing egalitarian movements that are nice to see, but not full steps. And there are more steps that could be taken. So I would add, like, underneath it, what is the actual thrust of American desire? Where do Americans want to be? I'd argue that we're seeing the best of it right now, and that's the part that worries me. I made this argument before, Nick, that I think we're in a place where people are just being more open about what they actually believe, rather than hiding it, or that they're connecting it in that way. Sorry for the ramble. I'll let you go.
No, I think I agree with parts of what you're saying there, and disagree with other parts. I do think there's a separate problem of right-wing populism and neoliberal centrism, and they, and also I think I want to highlight, sometimes I struggle a little bit with these conversations, because I feel like people are asking, there's a jumping back and forth between scale, right? Somebody asks me, how do I help my grandfather right here, right now, right? And I say, get them out of the fucking house, get them away from the television.
No, very much.
Right. But you're right that that's not a solution, right? That's a short-term reduce harm, like harm prevention. That's a needle exchange is what I'm saying, right? That's not a solution, right?
And I back that. So, and I don't want it to seem like I'm not for that. There's been a discourse on a lot of left sort of YouTube talking about Andrew Tate and how the left doesn't do anything for men and dating, and how there's no leftist dating advice. And I got in a little bit of shit because I said that I disagree with that. I do believe that we need to do things that are generalized harm reduction. I did vote for Biden. I did vote for Hillary, and I did campaign for both of them. But for me, I think maybe it's my old age. I'm just getting tired of this. Well, you can do this little one thing, but then what about the weed underneath it, or the roots? How do we attack the roots?
Yeah, I mean, so that's what we've been what I've been on about for the first half of this, was that the roots, I think, are this kind of toxic meritocracy and exploitative low road capitalism together.
The very idea of meritocracy itself is extraordinary and awful.
Right. And so I think that the solution is teach everybody that's luck all the way down. That's the big utopian philosophical change that I think could potentially bring about larger scale cultural change. That's a multi-generational solution, though. It can help with your grandfather a little bit, actually. I've had some success even with conservatives, helping them, through some code switching about there, but for the grace of God, go you, that those people, you can engender a little bit of more compassion sometimes, or a little bit more humility. You can't necessarily go quite as far with it, but any amount of progress, I think, actually helps take the edge off. Because a lot of times, the porn, the anger porn that OAN or Fox News or whoever is pumping out is mostly unfairness porn, right? It's this projection of a world where bad people are succeeding and good people are suffering, right? And it's meant to inflame your moral outrage in this kind of way. And so a mix of getting people away from moral outrage porn, but also helping to turn down their desire for punitive justice, for retribution upon people who they think deserve to suffer. And this is something that's true on the left too, I think, actually. Talk about your issue with men and stuff. I think it's pretty fair to say at this point that men need real help in modernity, that they do not have the kinds of projects of worth, I think, that are available to previously marginalized communities who are working towards social justice are not available to them in the same kinds of ways, or they feel like a lot of them don't get the same sense of meaning from engaging in those kinds of projects. And I think they feel like they are excluded or prevented from previous kinds of projects that were deeply unethical, but were part of society. And so we need to provide them an alternative, or better alternatives, I think. And instead, I think a lot of people on the left, because they're burned out on empathy, or however we want to talk about it, are really strongly reactionary to that idea and are fuck them, fuck men. I don't care if they're suffering. Well, and I think that does contribute to a problem in this way.
Well, and it's one of the troubles. And I think, again, I always try to look at it is it a symptom of something, or is it the cause, or is it the problem? And I think the alienation white men feel, and the reason projects don't work for them, is because the vast majority of projects I've seen on help for those at sort of the sides of community, the minorities, the exploited, generally speaking, the help is actually focused on making you a better capitalist resource, where we focus on, for example, and I use this as an example all the time, with gay marriage, how it came about and how it got legalized, is not because we had the real conversation about how everyone just should have the fucking right It was actually a lot of gay men and gay women coming out and proving that they could be a good husband and wife and follow that typical stereotype of what a marriage is.
I thought you were going to go to like how much we could make off of gay marriage ceremonies.
No.
Wedding cakes.
It's
like monetarily, like there's a whole business industry there, right?
The
like
moment that the conversation switched over and became, no, we too can become this Oedipal framework. Don't worry about it. We're not going to be weirdo gays. We're not like the weirdos over there. We're going to be the good husband and wife team, and we can do that. You see the same thing with trans and those who fight on the side of conservatives. They're hyper passing, they're hyper feminine, they fall into the same categories that our power structures demand. And so when we have these sort of projects that are there to help the unhoused, for example, it's not to help the unhoused become like happy people, it's to help them get back into the workforce. As an example, it is to help people get back to this. It's help drug users be productive members of society. It is to push us back into this thing. And white men are fucked on this one because we are already that machine. And so the projects that work for us don't work because that's our lives are basically that thing. We don't have the same repression. Our repression exists as a deep alienation and a symptom that sort of reveals the rest of this being the case. So as we start looking at, well, how do we have this and how do we talk about these things? I would even argue that we need to go deeper and we need to start doing what the left has failed to do for my entire life. And I would say for 100 years, since the days of Eugene Debs, the days of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and some other great leftists from that era. They did this very well, but it's having the simple conversations because we've relegated the simple ones to talk about dating as a very simple one. It isn't that we need to figure out a way to give dating advice on the left. It's that we need to talk about what dating is and why that paradigm is false. This is the challenge we have is we've accepted and ceded all of this ground. We've ceded the entirety of what it means to be an American or a person or someone in the space or anything to this kind of paradigm. So instead of saying we need to have dating advice for men, no, we need to actually rearrange that because dating is based out of courtship, which places men and women or one person versus another in a game of attrition as you're trying to basically wear the other person down or make your way into getting into their pants or fuck them because fucking them is a goal. Instead, the opposite. We need to say, no, dating is stupid. Dating is garbage. Dating is part of the structure. Step back, work on yourself, go out and do things with friends. And by the way, when you do that and you work on it, you're going to find people to fuck. You're just going to like change the paradigm, shift the discussion. Eugene Debs did this with work and how people handled it. Because prior to that, you couldn't possibly think that you shouldn't just be working. But his simple conversations, the easy ways he wrote, the ways he started these, it was resetting. It's not a job that you should be thankful for. It's a job they should be thanking you for. Marx flipped it all. It isn't that you're a worker. It's that you're the one producing. The capitalist does nothing. Landlords do nothing. These are the conversations we need to be having as the left and as the egalitarians, because it changes the conversation. Elon Musk is, as far as meritocracy goes, the literal examples of it. Just open the book and go, here's the stories. Elon Musk is a king of proving that meritocracy is a failure, and he's doing such a good job of it right now. It's amazing. But if you go through and you go like Mr. Wonderful, Kevin O'Leary, he's on Dragon's Den, he's on Shark Tank, he's the guy, he's a brilliant investor, until you literally look into him and you realize he's an absolute fool, liar, piece of shit who's actually never really been successful at anything and makes up a lot of stuff as he goes. His big thing was selling, he destroyed the learning software education industry. The entire thing. If you remember Broderbund software and like Carmen Sandiego and all that shit, he's the reason it didn't turn into anything, which is amazing. So the idea of meritocracy is just opening the book. It is shining light on the reality of it, and then having a different conversation around what success means, around what money means, around what business means, and starting from a simpler conversation than down the road where we're already here and we're trying to, yes, Grandpa, I'm not going to let you watch Fox News. Like, we've already lost. Grandpa's going to die. We got nothing. Like, great, it's fine. I know you want to have a relationship. I want to have a relationship with my dad, but I want a better place for my son. And my son needs to be in a place where he's having that other discussion. That is the point. It's radical positions of the police. I think absolutely. Sorry, go ahead. I'll let you go.
No, I just like I don't want to interrupt you or anything, but I
I
think some
want
of this
you
gets
to. I
too
will never
binary.
shut the fuck up. Nick will tell you.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm not a host of the show, so I don't. I just want to have another
he's
guest
not
here.
he's Brooks is a guest. So you're
Yeah.
yeah, please.
So, I think there's too much. There's too much slipping into a binary about helping future individuals versus helping present individuals. I think, we were talking population ethics before. Yes, I would love to see the radical culture, utopia that I want to live in, with, everybody acknowledging that it's luck all the way down. That's not necessarily going to happen in my lifetime. And in my lifetime, people are going to suffer a lot. And I need to ameliorate that suffering too. So I don't think, for example, that I would want to say to people that dating is dumb and everyone should abandon the concept of dating, because I think I'm a pluralist and some people like dating. And I think, they like it not just because they were habituated by capitalism to like it. I think they just genuinely enjoy it. And I think they should be sort of free to do so. And I think that we should give dating advice to young men, and help them, understand,
Consent.
women and relationships more. I think that is valuable. And I don't think it has to be an either or, where we either, smash dating or we give them dating advice. I think we can do both, and I think it's important to do both. I think the same thing is going to be true for reinventing our economic systems, right? I'm for a more socialist, less capitalist system than we currently have. But here's the thing. I don't think it's accurate to say that capital does nothing, for example. I think there's a fact of the matter that the consolidation of wealth allows for the creation of programs and projects that you couldn't achieve if you didn't consolidate the wealth in that way. What I think we need to get rid of is the idea that people who have capital got there because they deserved it, and so they deserve a greater share of the rewards, rather than the reality is some people are born with money and others are born with various abilities, and at the end of the day, we should be pooling these resources in such a, a wealth fund, so that's such that everyone is having increasingly high quality of life. And that might involve some amount of capitalism, and that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I wholly disagree on that last point, but I agree with the previous one. The idea that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to understand that we are talking to a spectrum of humanity who have grown up at different periods, who are talking at different times. And there's a reason I would use the same language, I think, in a different way with my dad, very different language, than I would with my son, than I would with, I run a Duluth server, like my philosophy server. It's all about knowing who you're talking to and how. But I would say that if we are only responding, if we're only reacting, it's the old saying, reactionaries react to power, revolutionaries seize it. And the question is for us, are we going to seize power? And we can do it while we're doing the other. It's not one or the other. It's just a matter of if we're going to throw all of our chips in on starting the conversation way down the line and not start to figure out how we destroy the weeds, we are actually only reinforcing the current power structure. Now, we're making the power structure slightly better. We're causing less harm. I'm all for that. Again, I voted for Hillary. You fucking get out and vote. Go do your thing. But
yeah,
if we're not doing more.
Well, what do you mean by seizing power here? Because I think this is something that I find confusing sometimes, because I don't believe there's a lever called power that you could seize. So I'm not sure what, besides the changing of culture on a grand scale, that I the kind of luck stuff that I'm talking about, where, my view is you're not going to seize power. What you're going to need to do is change enough minds that all the people in all the positions of power, enough of them are leaning in the right direction, ethically speaking, because there's no power to seize. There's just powers.
Trying to figure out a way to simplify this response.
Mm-hmm.
So no, there is no lever of power. Generally speaking, what I'm talking to is reacting against any force of repression. The question is whether or not you're going to do what that force of repression does, or whether you're going to usurp it and take it for yourself. And everyone, literally every person, has the power to do this at all times, with all things, not necessarily with power in the militaristic or the statewide sense, but in the ways that we react and how we sort of define ourselves and the things around us. That tends to be more what I'm being very specific here. So let's be very, how I'm talking about doing it. When we go about dating and we talk about dating, if in the dating pool, I see that there's a lot of issues with it, and there's a male-female divide even still today. Somehow I'm hearing that even amongst the kids today, it is still normal for women to expect that men are paying, that men are the ones who ask them out. It's less common for women to ask men out. Like, it's been 25 years, more different. It's all the same kind of shit. So they ask, well, what's your advice? How do I get laid? That's the question they want to ask. And my answer would be, that's the wrong fucking question. My answer would be that asking how to get laid is the wrong goal. Asking about that is the problem, because we've created an image societally of that. So now I'm talking one-to-one to the guy, and I go, what you need to do is you need to treat this person as a person. Be yourself. And if you're going to fuck, you're going to fuck. You're going to find out. It's going to be enthusiastic consent is the term, where you don't even really have consent, but it's so enthusiastic, it's obvious. You're going to have a great time. But you need to be yourself. You need to be open to it, and you need to be allowing it. This would be the advice I'd give young people, not dating advice. Dating advice is, hey, here's how you do it. Here's how you hit on a girl. Here's how you get her number. Here's how you take her out one-on-one.
But is all dating advice pickup artists? I don't think that's true. Like, I think
what would dating advice be otherwise?
I think dating advice would be something like, so for example, I would push back on the claim trying to get laid is the wrong goal. I think for some people, trying to get laid is the right goal, and that's fine. And
that's terrifying. That's a horrifying thing.
Because some people enjoy getting laid, and they should not be sort of guilted or shamed into wanting something different.
That's not that sex parties exist, sex clubs exist, people exist who just like to fuck. That's not dating.
Well, and
it is for some people. I mean, like I know. So, for example, I know polyamorous individuals who have romantic partners and fuck buddies, and like
do they call it dating?
Yeah, sometimes.
Oh,
they date multiple partners.
I think there may be some talking
partners
past.
Are like.
There may be a little talking past, because I think you actually both agree on this for the most part. I think it's just you're slightly using what the term.
I guess
dating.
What I'm just trying to clarify. Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to clarify that we don't have to always be sort of maximally revolutionary in the way we're talking about something like this issue. I do think that, and I think we have to be careful that in being that, we don't overcorrect. So I think it's okay to have hookups where you don't sort of, like, I'm not saying disrespect.
I'm not saying not to hook up.
I know. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, I think there's this idea that, we need to swing back towards, more meaningful connection or something like that in all of our interactions, and that is too much pressure in that direction, and can lead to a kind of that trad cath lifestyle. I think. Yeah.
For clarity, I think what he's saying though is actually more about a type of presence. Instead of having this goal that you want to get laid, sort of just engage with people presently, and then the result is either you get laid or you don't. But I do want to try to focus this a bit more on the topic, and I want to try to go for maybe about 5 to 10 more minutes, if that's good for you guys, and then everyone get in there. Their final words. So it does seem like you both actually have a great deal of agreement. I'm going to frame it in the way Aaron had framed it earlier, which is that and one of the points I'd wanted to make was meritocracy. You had said, Aaron, that meritocracy has the downside of playing into our intuition. So it seems intuitive, and I think one of the reasons it seems intuitive almost is because it's almost Darwinian. It seems to be how nature works. It's the people who can best mount a defense against nature in one way or another that are going to thrive, and the ones that fail to do so, the ones that fail to get up and hunt and go earn the food, who don't. So it seems to mirror that. So. Given that, it does sound like you would both be, if we're going to say that that's almost capitalist in nature, it sounds like there is large agreement between the two of you that fundamentally the problem, and Brooks, you had said egalitarian earlier, it sounds like you also agree that a lack of equality is a huge part of the problem in, I would assume, in extremism. He didn't say that, but that's what we're talking about is what's fomenting extremism. And would you agree that inequality on some level is part of that, and is the meritocracy to blame for, or contributing to that, or is it operating on some other level in some other way?
So I think the meritocracy is absolutely the idea of meritocracy. Again, what we're getting at, and it's the way I underlie all of this, is what is the image people are giving themselves of why they feel or why they think of things. And from birth, especially in America, but throughout the West and throughout the world, I think we can safely say, just generally speaking, with some exceptions, we are born with this idea that people are born certain ways. Some people are good, some people are bad. We have it as a thing that runs all the way through, from Santa Claus giving good kids toys, and good kids have more, bad kids get coal, bad kids get nothing, all the way through to how we treat our education system, all the way through to how we treat people once they're out. It is, you have goals, you need to achieve those goals, and people who achieve those goals are more successful and better than you. My underlying thing, and this is where I think I am slightly different, I don't believe people should have goals, and I think goals are the fucking problem underneath all of it, because basically what we're doing is we've given people an image of what they ought to be, and the more that they're indoctrinated with that, the more they are told, here is the image of what you ought to be, here is what good people will be, and then the further we are from that mark, the more we internalize the pain that comes with that. And it's one of those things that I think happens to everyone across the board, but the radicalized are, I think, extremely susceptible to this. They have been given an image. They have been told this is what the good is, and they do all of the image things. This is, again, what is the image that is conjured when we say dating? What is the image that is conjured when we say successful? When we say the best in class? When we say a man? When we say a father? When we say a husband? When we say whatever it may be, the image that's conjured never is going to be what we can achieve. That's an image. It's fantasy. It's bullshit. But instead, the way our life emergently turns out takes a right turn or a left turn because of contingent circumstances. And we blame those contingent circumstances. We blame the things we want to. And we get more and more frustrated as repression grows more and more as we try to overcorrect. And I think it's a easy case for us to make that this is the vast majority of people who are on the hard right or even semi-right. I mean, it's the nature of reactionary thought in general.
And Aaron?
Yeah, so I do think we agree to some extent on the meritocracy thing, on some of the things that need to be disassembled. I think it sounds like we might disagree on issues about things like moral education. I'm clearly in favor of a more robust account of like moral education and teaching people what it is to be a good person and helping them develop a life of flourishing. By doing that, I think part of the problem with liberalism is that we're afraid to do that for fear of indoctrinating people the way that conservatives do, which means that we don't give people a good, secular ethical framework, as well as give them a good secular account of a life of meaning. We sort of just say, go out there and kind of figure it out for yourself. And a lot of people can't or don't. And that's a problem that I think we need to help them with. And, we've been talking about dating. One of the groups that I think is particularly sort of important in this domain is incels, and talking about the way that there is this community of incels. And there's a lot of misunderstandings about what drives incel behavior, a lot of jokes about, buy them sex or something like that don't understand the sense of like the way that they feel that they are being disrespected, that they are told that they live in a fair dating world and they don't actually, and they know it, and they're angry about that and they're tired of being lied to. I think we need to help folks like that. We need to provide them alternatives to the Andrew Tates of the world. And I personally don't like attaching any virtue to any gender, right? Like, I don't think it's true that courage is a masculine trait or something like that. But for some people, they need to understand their life of flourishing as having a gendered element to it. And for them, they need to think that they are doing this thing because they're a good man in particular, or a good woman in particular, or something. And just like the people who I know who are religious and deeply moral, I don't necessarily want to try to take that away from them if that is the thing that is going to work for them. And I don't think that like asking them all to just completely abandon that part of their psyche is going to necessarily work. And, we're always going to be arguing over like, how much incrementalism can we allow before we are just succumbing to the status quo versus how much radicalism can we push for before we're just going to, lead to another January 6th. I'm still probably pretty radical, but I do think that we need to be working on universal compassion, even towards, the incels and the landlords and all the people, even the Elon Musks of the world.
We had a super chat. Well, let me hit the super chat
real quick.
Okay, please.
Nope, jumping in, Nick. Sorry.
All right.
And this is, I think, this is where we disagree for sure, and it's a very specific divergence, because when we talk about incels, and I talk about them too, because I find the entire thing fascinating, and I've known a couple, and some of the first incels, you might say, that as we start talking about, they think they live in a fair dating world, but they don't. That's the problem. They don't live in a dating world. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as that structure. It's completely fabricated and made up as a thing. And by having that thing called dating, people going out and having a good time, that's people going out and having a good time. Labeling it as dating and labeling it as relationship intensification that is on its way towards fucking, which is what dating is called. That's the image that is conjured. By even doing that, we are starting this idea that there is a dating regiment, in the same way that there is a Bush League and AAA balls before you hit the pros. Like, there's none of that. It's just people. There is no dating structure. By having that, we call those images to people. By having that, we start telling people, here is the thing to aim for, here is what is possible, and we name it. And when people don't see that, or when they do, we end up putting them in positions that naturally creates deep, deep, deep repression, as most people at the base level just want to go hang out and do stuff, but we've told them and taught them, you need to go out for sex, you need to go do these things, and you need to go date. Dating is how you find people. It's not how I found people. I mean, that's how I found my ex-wife. That was not great. How I found the best relationship I've ever had is just by being around people. And then it turns out I like a few of them. And that's the vast majority of good relationships I've heard have kind of come out of the same sort of thing. That setup, and if we move all the way down to the people politically who are angry for their lack of success capitalistically, we need to say it's less directly. And this is why I hesitate to use meritocracy, because at any point when we say, well, the system isn't fair, no, there is no system. We've defined it. We make this. There is nothing there. We've decided that we're perfectly okay with people dying on the streets. We're cool with that. Now, this is not a fair meritocracy, for sure. But the reality is the system that we've created, the images of it are ultimately what create the goals that people have, and then the images of what they find possible in their life, which creates the repression internally, which defines them and suppresses emergent behaviors and general pushes forward, especially creative impulses. As I like to say, if a person born does random shit, whatever they see in front of them, all of their life, and then dies, I consider that to be a life well lived. You don't have to be a productive member of anything.
All right. What I'm going to do is, we got a super chat, so I'm going to read that super chat, and then I want to wrap it up. I think it's been a really good discussion. It's gotten much deeper than I had anticipated, which I like. So that's great. So what I'm going to do is we'll do the super chat, we'll do a wrap up, and then I think we'll be done. And we can always revisit and have you guys back on at another time. Sinister Porpoise, $2. Musk is an incompetent coder and not meritorious. Thank you, Sinister, for your continued support. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate usually, as everyone here knows, we get demonetized quite a lot, so the super chats always help a lot, and now we've gotten a lot of likes and people supporting the stream.
There's a great series of
thank you all.
Series of videos called Debunking Elon Musk. If you can find the channel, it's wonderful. It's literally like 90 videos going over almost everything Musk has ever said, showing how he's just lied and full of shit on everything. It's great.
I think I had heard about that, and I was gonna.
I'll send it over to you.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, do that, and I'll put it in the description down at the bottom. So if you're seeing this after it aired, the description should be down in there. And we've also got a description for Aaron's podcast and everything. Perfect. We've got all that down in the already in the description, and I'd like each of you also to, if there's anything that you want to talk about, where people can find you. Any last thoughts on the topic or anything else, and where people can find you if you're interested in people finding you. So let's start with Brooks.
Yeah. So you can't really find me much of anywhere. I do some random stuff for work. That's the closest I get to social media. But on YouTube, you can follow the DGQC, the 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐚𝐬 Quarantine Collective. I run a 3,500 person Discord server that sort of focuses on critical theory and the French tradition that follows Deleuze, Bergson, and a few others. Michel Serres has been my new muse. We do multiple readings a week, and we basically sit and explain pretty complex, fun theory stuff for fun because we have mental problems. And so that's an easy thing. You can find us there.
Yeah, that's you just described every philosopher I know. Aaron and I were talking about that in the beginning. So, Titan pointed out, and this is true, you can also find him on President Sundays, and we usually drop links to President Sundays on the Discord pretty frequently. So, Brooks, if you send me that link, or that would be great. I'll put it in the description and make sure I hold on to it for future appearances when you come on. Let's see. There it is. All right. Perfect. Thank you. And Aaron, where can people find you, and final thoughts?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at ETVPod, or Facebook is the Philosophers in Space group. Come join us and hang out and chat. But I definitely want to plug the UK Skeptic Mag, not the Michael Shermer one. They do a lot of really good work on, compassionate skepticism and debunking, while also trying to help people avoid things like homeopathy and a lot of, the real world harms of misinformation, on top of the angst that our grandparents are all having to deal with. But yeah, thanks for having me on. I think these are really complex issues, and there's no easy solutions, but I do hope that the luck stuff can push some people in a better direction.
A fascinating discussion. Like I said, John Torek was already one that I was, you seem to be hitting very similar to that. So it was very, I found it fascinating. So thank you very much. Xandering, we know where people can find you. They can find you in the truck stop, third lot to the left. Anything that, any final thoughts?
I was half expecting you to trot out Ringo Turek next. I mean, we've got to spell all the others, John.
You know what? I need a co-host who respects me. The problem is I don't think there's such a thing. I guess
my final thoughts are, obviously, if you want to find me, go to random truck stops until you track me down. Good luck with that. Or you can find me here. Pretty much that's about it. I guess my final thought for the whole thing is it's along the lines of, this is at least a good problem to have. We're talking about all of these different issues and how do we fix society? Well, thankfully, we have a society to try and fix. If we didn't, if society completely broke down all across the world, we wouldn't be worried so much about these things, because we'd be too worried about finding our next food or stopping that predator from eating us. At least, we've made the progress of getting to civilization. Now, I think that our next hurdle to try and overcome is going to be getting a civilization that actually works for all of its citizens.
Yeah, what's the line? Civilization, it's yours if you can keep it.
Yeah, exactly. So at least we've gotten that far, and as was pointed out earlier, I think rightly, in the course of evolution, having a couple thousand years of civilization is still fairly new. Let's hopefully keep civilization for the next 1,000 years, and maybe we can make it even better.
Spectacular note to end on. Thank you very much, Xandering. I'd like to thank Aaron for coming back to this madhouse, glutton for punishment that he is. Thank you so much for coming back, and I'm sure we'll be seeing more of you. I hope to be seeing more of you. Brooks, thank you for coming, as always. Really glad you could.
Sorry, I was late.
That's all right. I was very glad you could make it. Xandering, good as always to have you here with me, engaging with our guests. So thank you so much for for joining us. We will be doing Commander McMillan will not be free for downtime. It may just actually downtime. It may just be Xandring and I. We haven't done a downtime together in a very long time, so that will be fun. I think that's probably tentatively what we're doing on Thursday. Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be on with Operator Starsky. He is Ukrainian National Guardsman. He is in Kyiv. And when he is able to stream, when he's not being bombed, we interview him and talk about what's going on, what's happening on the front lines, how Ukraine is dealing with the crisis, and so on. He's a very good guy to talk with, and we are delighted to be able to do that. That will be on Friday. So thank you all for joining us. Look forward to seeing you then. Come join us on the Discord. We are following a couple of stories that we're going to stay on top of, Brazil in particular, but a couple of other ones. That's always on our Discord. Thank you all again, and we will see you, barring any breaking news. Every time I say that, it's I know it's tempting fate. We look forward to seeing you on Thursday for downtime. Thank you all, and have a good night.